4 minutes past the hour. My heart stood still. That's the Oscar Peterson Trio live at the CBC studios, not Congressional Black Caucus, the Canadian Broadcasting Company studios. It was recorded in 1960, released in 1997, and that's one of my favorite Oscar Peterson releases, probably because that's what got me really into really listening to Oscar Peterson. I had heard of him. I had, of course, sitting there with my dad and my mother, but as a kid and whatnot. But that one grabbed my ear, and so that's again, I'm not qualifying it. I'm just saying. Anyway, that's Oscar Peterson on piano, Ray Brown on bass, and Ed Thigpen on drums. And listening to Ed Thigpen, when you listen to Oscar Peterson, when you listen to the trio, you really need to listen to Ed Thigpen on drums because he was incredibly underrated. According to my next guest, as the U.S. Civil War concluded in 1865, Hawaii was ruled by a modernizing monarchy. There were relatively high rates of literacy, while the advent of electricity and telephones preceded their arrival in a good deal of the U.S. The monarchy was highly influential in Asia. So, what led to Euro Americans overthrowing the monarchy? Let's talk with my next guest. He holds the John J. and Rebecca Moore's Chair of History and African American Studies at the University of Houston. He's one of the most prolific writers of our time. He's Dr. Gerald Horne. As always, Gerald, welcome back.
Thank you for inviting me.
Before we get to the book, there are two issues that I'd like to get your take on. First, the Supreme Court decision relevant to regarding the Voting Rights Act of 1965. Justices John Roberts, Clarence Thomas, Samuel Alito have accomplished what I see as one of their life's missions in a 6-3 party line decision in Calais v. Louisiana. I think it was a highly political decision, less of a legal decision. They, to a great degree, have just gutted Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act, which protected minority voters against racial gerrymandering and voter disenfranchisement. I'd like to get your take on that and then get into a brief conversation because a lot of folks don't understand there are a couple of different types of gerrymandering, and it's not always bad. Dr. Gerald Horne.
You are correct to suggest that this is a major setback for progressivism. It's a major setback for the Black community. It's a major setback for domestic tranquility. Recall that it was only a few decades ago that the Klansmen and Nazi leaders, speaking of David Duke, received a majority of the Euro-American vote in his race to become governor of Louisiana. Louisiana precisely at issue with regard to this case that we're discussing. It's also ironic indeed to remember that it was not so long ago that the right wing was complaining about the Supreme Court led by Chief Justice Earl Warren, that it was a kind of super legislature, for example. And now, as Justice Kagan suggests in her scathing dissent, the conservative majority has become the ultimate super legislature because, as Justice Kagan suggested, this issue to a degree had been resolved by Congress, which is the actual legislature. But the Supreme Court, in its lack of wisdom, substituted its judgment for that of the U.S. Congress. I would be remiss if I failed to mention as well that it also reflects certain ideological weaknesses in the civil rights community. as you know, I've made a practice of criticizing the Faustian bargain, the devilish bargain that was made with NAACP some decades ago, where in return for anti-Jim Crow concessions like the Voting Rights Act of 1965, they would stab in the back and throw overboard progressive leaders like Paul Robeson. I'm afraid to say that I'm not even sure if the civil rights community recalls the history that has led to this pickle. This is a reflection of the fact that if you have a muscle and do not exercise it, it tends to atrophy. And their critical faculties have tended to atrophy in light of a failure to recollect how we got into this dilemma in the first instance, which involved us not only tossing overboard those like Robeson, but steering clear of sticky foreign policy questions. It's similarly remarkable that as this Iran catastrophe grinds on, many of our civil rights organizations, and not to mention Black intellectuals, don't have a mumbling word to say about it. It's if they cannot recall that our steering clear of foreign policy was a result of a bargain where we would get concessions, but now the concessions have stopped flowing. They're still sticking to the bargain, like a drowning man to a frail life raft, for example. So this does not bode well for our community. This does not bode well for the United States. And until we recognize how we got into this position, we'll continue to be singing the blues.
I said in the first hour, I said I'm going to interject some laws of physics into this discussion, and that is Newton's third law of motion, that for every action, there's an equal and opposite reaction. That Donald Trump was a reaction to the election of Barack Obama. That in just about every instance, and I'm asking you this as a historian because you know the details a hell of a lot better than I do, that every time we take a step forward, there are interests that do everything in their power to take us back. And so this unraveling of the 65 Voting Rights Act, which has taken 40 years, but they're now able to say, mission accomplished. That as soon as Johnson signed it, they started working to unravel it.
Oh, indeed. And not only does the civil rights community deserve justifiable criticism for failing to anticipate what has just befallen us, they should have recognized this dilemma when Clarence Thomas supplanted Thurgood Marshall on the highest bench in the land. Thurgood Marshall, despite a certain kind of heroism, was also part of that devil's bargain, and he was rewarded by getting a lifetime appointment to the Supreme Court. But when he passed away and George H.W. Bush replaced him with Clarence Thomas, that should have been the message
Mm-hmm.
that something was awry. But it's not only the civil rights community that deserves justifiable criticism. Many of our friends on the left of various ancestries also deserve criticism because supposedly their calling card is an acknowledgement of the class question. That's at least what they keep telling us.
Mm-hmm.
But if you were to do an analysis of the Trump base, if you were to do an analysis of history, you would recognize instantaneously that a significant percentage of the settler descendant working class allies with the right. How else can you explain Donald Trump getting 77 million votes in November 2024? And so if you're a general in charge of the civil rights community, you need to take that into account, and you need to also understand history and understand that the way we were able to make progress in the face of these formidable odds lined up against us was by internationalizing our struggle. But that's the weapon we gave up when we signed that devil's bargain in the 1950s, the Compromise of 1954, as I call it, referring to the Brown versus Board of Education decision under the leadership of Justice Earl Warren. So, like a good mystery novel, there are a number of potential culprits with regard to who is responsible for this fiasco. There's a lot of discredit to go around.
And as we move into this, to pause for a moment, I think to one element of validation for your point is if you go back and read Dr. King's "Where do we go from here?" And you're talking about the left, he says, and I'll paraphrase, you have to be wary. You can't trust the white liberal. That they want to spare the Negro of the lash of brutality, but have never been focused on equality. And that every time the discussion of jobs comes up, they tell us now's not the time. And he says that he has come to understand that they have more in common, that being the white liberal, they have more in common with the oppressor than with the oppressed. I think that is along the same lines as the point that you were making. We're at 15. We're at 15 past the hour. Dr. Wilmer Leon here. Inside the Issues is where you are, Sirius XM 126 Urban View. The book is The Counterrevolution of 1893, The Hawaii Coup and the U.S. Roots of U.S. Imperialism in the Asia-Pacific Basin. We're going to get to that with the author, Dr. Gerald Horne, on the other side. Do yourselves a favor, folks. Keep it locked right here, Sirius XM 126 Urban View. Past the hour. Dr. Wilmer Leon here. Inside the Issues is where you are, Sirius XM 126 Urban View. And that is My Heart Stood Still, the Oscar Peterson Trio live at the CBC studios in 1960. And that was live in studio. The Oscar Peterson Trio, Oscar Peterson on piano, Ray Brown on bass, Ed Thigpen on drums. And there is just so much when you listen to Oscar, there's so much history that you hear in his hands. It is phenomenal to me. Dr. Gerald Horne is my guest. His book is The Counter-Revolution of 1893, The Hawaii Coup and the U.S. and the Roots of U.S. Imperialism in the Asia-Pacific Basin. And before we get directly to that, I want to indirectly move in that direction by getting your take, Gerald, on Pete Hegseth's utterly foolish display in his Senate testimony yesterday as he's trying to defend this budget and trying to defend the U.S. Attack on Iran. Your thoughts?
Well, first of all, it's apparent that Mr. Hegseth was performing for an audience of one, the man who sits in the Oval Office. But he needs to be reminded that Pam Bondi, the sacked Attorney General, had a similar display of pyrotechnics before Congress, where she said that instead of looking at Jeffrey Epstein, you should look at the stock market. That's what we should be talking about, which left many of us gobsmacked. But in any case, her performing for an audience of one did not save her from being sacked. And I dare say that it will not save Mr. Hegseth as well, particularly in light of these recent leaks from Vance World. Speaking of the office of J.D. Vance, where the Atlantic has been reporting that Mr. Vance objects to the reality that Mr. Hegseth is misinforming not only Mr. Trump, but a wider audience with regard to this fiasco, this debacle in Iran, which bids fair not only to weaken the United States globally, but it also bids fair to shake to its very foundations the so-called Anglo-American alliance, which had attained global hegemony for hundreds of years, but now is on the cusp of being dislodged, a reality that will come clear perhaps when Mr. Trump himself lands in Beijing in a few weeks. And you may see a kind of handing over of the baton of global leadership to President Xi Jinping. by a reluctant Mr. Trump.
Your thoughts, Friedrich Merz, the German chancellor, made the comment last week that the United States is being outmaneuvered, has been outnegotiated, has basically been outplayed. And he says that as Hegseth is sitting there in the Senate trying to rationalize the irrational. Um, you, um, you, what did Fred Hampton say? You wind up with answers that don't answer, uh, explanations that don't explain. That's what we seem to be getting here: answers that don't answer, explanations that don't explain.
Indeed, and Chancellor Merz also added that U.S., Washington, is being humiliated, his word, not
Right,
mine,
right.
by the Iranians. And for a man as sensitive as Mr. Trump is with regard to personal slights, that had to cut to the core of his psychological being. I should also say that Mr. Trump, with regard to his being the protector of U.S. imperialism, has reacted in a typical manner by cutting off his nose to spite his face. What I mean by that is the recent decision to withdraw thousands of U.S. troops from Germany, as if that's going to hurt Germany, which is busily rearming, by the way.
Hmm.
And those of us with a historical sense recall that Berlin and Washington crossed swords between 1942 and 1945, for example. And with Mr. Trump going cool on the Ukraine escapade, this will give further incentive for Germany to build up its military with consequences too ghastly to contemplate. It's not only Germany, Spain has become a punching bag for Mr. Trump. And in retaliation, in Barcelona, just a few days ago, there was an important anti Trump gathering called with President Petro of Colombia, President Sheinbaum of Mexico, President Ramaphosa of South Africa, Prime Minister Mia Mottley of Barbados, all present. We all know that France, in particular, has this idea of strategic autonomy from the United States. And given the fact of Mr. Trump's threats to Canada and Canada's threatening to join the European Union itself, believe it or not, this will further compromise the global position of the United States of America.
Final point on this, and I'm always trying to connect the dots. Shameless plug for my former previous podcast. Uh, I don't hear hardly any discussion as we look at the fiasco uh, in Iran, and then you listen to Mertz. I don't hear any discussion about the bombing of the Nord Stream pipeline, the intentional deindustrialization of Germany, the Maidan coup in 2014 in Ukraine, and then where we are now in Ukraine, as well as in. I, to me, you don't have to go too far to connect those dots. But unfortunately, too many people still want to engage in some level of analysis of these things as as though they're occurring in a vacuum or siloed.
Well, it's not just the civil rights community that has a poor sense of history. I think you could say that's true altogether for the chattering classes in the United States of America, and that would include the media in particular. This may be inevitable given the fact that the so-called republic is only 250 years old. Contrast that with Iran, which has a history going back 2,000 years or more, for example, which means there is a more dedicated historical sense there. But I think as well, it's a reflection of the fact that there are those at the top level of the United States who are reluctant to confront history because the history is so bloody and it contrasts, it complicates this idea, the Reagan-like idea of the United States as this shining city on a hill. So there are many elements that go into what you've just articulated, but in any case, it does not leave the United States in an advantageous position as the challenges continue to mount.
And also, final point here, is that I bring those things up to connect those dots to also throw into the conversation. You hear a lot of people say now, see, if you'd only voted for Kamala Harris, we wouldn't have this problem. You see, we told you, but that's why I brought those points up because it's not just Donald Trump. The Nord Stream pipeline, Joe Biden blew that up. The the deindustrialization of Germany, that took place during the Biden administration. The Maidan coup took place, I believe, during the Obama administration. So it's we can't get locked into these politics of personality, thinking that Kamala Harris, with her lovely smile, is going to make it all good. Because as Amiri Baraka, said to me once, he said, Wilmer, they're all functionaries of the United States government.
Well, as you suggest, we have to be very careful right now as the Republican Party stumbles into what very well may be a debacle on the first Tuesday in November of 2026, which does not allow for it possibly to make a recovery by the first Tuesday of November 2028. The problem is that a major beneficiary may be the Democratic Party, which will then revert to its foreign policy of confronting Russia and China simultaneously, which is a fool's errand if you
Mm-hmm.
ever saw one,
Mm-hmm.
which will be complicated even more because with that foreign policy in tow, it would be difficult to execute at best in light of the alienation of the Federal Republic of Germany, of Spain, of Great Britain, of France, for example. And so the Democrats, if they had good sense, would be scrambling to develop new foreign policy priorities. But quite frankly, I don't see that happening.
Ladies and gentlemen, we're at 29 past the hour. Dr. Wilmer Leon here. The book, and we're getting to it when we come back. The Counter-Revolution of 1893, the Hawaii coup and the roots of U.S. imperialism in the Asia-Pacific basin. I wanted to lay a bit of a predicate or a foundation to this discussion by talking about some current events because I see some incredible parallels between what Dr. Horne wrote about in the Counter-Revolution of 1893, the whole idea of the roots of U.S. imperialism and where we are in the current moment. But let me tell you where I know I am in the current moment. I'm listening to some Oscar Peterson. My Heart Stood Still, the Oscar Peterson Trio, live at the CBC studios in 1960. Do yourselves a favor, folks. Keep it locked right here. Sirius XM 126 Urban View. Thirty-three past the hour. Dr. Wilmer Leon here. Inside the Issues is where you are, Sirius XM 126 Urban View. That's My Heart Stood Still, the Oscar Peterson Trio, live at the CBC studios in 1960. That's Oscar Peterson on piano, Ray Thigpen, I'm sorry, Ray Brown on bass, Ed Thigpen on drums. And I made the point earlier that Ed Thigpen is incredibly underrated as a drummer with Oscar Peterson. And another name just came to my mind, Peyton Crosley, who is the drummer in the Foresight group with Ron Carter, with the maestro Ron Carter. When you listen to his drummer, I hear some similarities in approach. And again, another phenomenal drummer doesn't get the credit that he is due. But sometimes somebody who does get credit and never gets enough, Dr. Gerald Horne. And the book is The Counter-Revolution of 1893, the Hawaii coup of the U.S. roots of U.S. imperialism. Um, Let me read this one uh, quick paragraph. The Hawaiians' repulse took place during the high tide of mainland slavery, inexorably linking the melanin rich royals to then degraded Africans. Already, there were U.S. nationals who had found their way to what was to become Indonesia, then riding under the reign of Dutch colonialism. Washington was eyeing control of this fabulously wealthy territory. Washington was eyeing control of this fabulously wealthy territory. When we look at President Trump allegedly, supposedly on his way to China at the end of the month, and the dynamics between the relationship between the United States and China, when we look at what the United States is trying, the war that the United States and Israel are waging on Iran right now, with China in the background there, um, the Hawaii coup and the U.S. and the roots of U.S. imperialism. I think the current machinations have imperialism written all over them, Dr. Gerald Horne.
Well, it's no accident, as historians like to say, that some of the most titanic conflicts Washington has been involved in have precisely been in Asia. Recall the conflict in Korea, 1950 to 1953, the conflict in Vietnam, concluding ignominiously in April 1975 with a hasty retreat by U.S. forces and allies from Vietnam. You just mentioned the ongoing confrontation with the People's Republic of China, and we would be remiss if we failed to include the events in West Asia, where a significant percentage of the lifeblood of a modern economy happen to be cited. Speaking of natural gas and oil, not least from the Straits of Hormuz, which Mr. Trump's bungling has turned over de facto to the Iranian authorities. And the war and the overthrow of the Hawaiian monarch was a step forward to the kinds of debacles that we're presently facing today. Recall that it was quickly followed by U.S. war in the Philippines in 1898. We should also point out the role of Black Americans, not only in this war in the Philippines, but as the words that you just read tended to indicate, the white supremacist government in Washington felt that the Hawaiian monarchs were not fit to rule precisely because they were dark-skinned, for example. They put out the canard that actually they were all descended from U.S. Negroes, for
In,
example.
in fact, let me read this quickly. Talking about Hawaii in the 1890s, Euro Americans across class lines overthrew the monarchy, denounced as quote unquote Negroes, and established an apartheid regime where the indigenous and those of Japanese and Chinese ancestry were barred from voting, as the Supreme Court just uh, gutted the 65 Voting Rights Act. Dr. Horne.
Well, that's part of the problem with this ill-advised adventure in the Hawaiian archipelago. In anticipation of the attempt to overthrow the regime in Honolulu, the monarch had reached across the Pacific to forge a de facto alliance with Tokyo, for example, which was in the process of rising as a power. Even today, it's possible to suggest that a plurality of the residents of the Hawaiian Islands happen to be of Japanese ancestry, a reflection of that alliance. The problem with barring people of Japanese ancestry from voting is that the Japanese Hawaiians had a powerful ally in Honolulu. And that points to the problem that Black Americans face, because, as noted, we've cut ties with any potential allies, which leaves us terribly isolated and subject to being bludgeoned and battered. I think you can draw a straight line, as I suggest in this book, from the establishment of the apartheid state with the targeting of Japanese Hawaiians in particular at the end of the 1890s and the so-called surprise attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7th, 1941, which plunged the United States into a bloody war with Japan, culminating with the atomic bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, August 9th, 1945, an atomic bombing that I would like to think will never be replicated again.
When you read Stephen Kinzer's book, Overthrow, and he talks about the United States seizing what were the Sandwich Islands, the archipelago that we now call Hawaii, he puts it or frames it in the context of sugar
Mhm.
and the economics behind sugar, and that there at the time was a tariff on importing sugar, and so a group of Christian, what do you call them?
Missionaries.
Missionaries. Thank you. Decided to, I guess, forsake Christ for the dollar and import sugar. Um, and but you take it beyond the economics and you put the ethnic dynamics into this conversation as well.
Indeed. And let me add a few footnotes to what you've just said. It's not only sugar, it's also pineapple. Some in your audience
Mr.
might be
Dole.
familiar with Dole pineapple, for
Mm-hmm.
example. The Dole family wound up ruling the archipelago after the overthrow of the monarchy. And I should also say that it ties into two fundamental concepts that we're still grappling with in the United States of America. That is to say, King Charles III just visited Washington. And when his predecessors were overthrown in 1776, they established what was called a republic or republicanism. What has been neglected, particularly by many of our friends on the left, is that republicanism, although we have been led to believe that is sufficiently flexible to include all of us, was not intended that way. It's no accident that our ancestors were not allowed to participate in the body politic in post 1776, or that the so-called Republicans who overthrew the monarch in the 1890s did not want any but those defined as, quote, white, unquote, to vote, which is, as noted, led to a conflict with Japan. But it's also that if you look at Hawaii's companion, speaking of the Golden State, California, there was a concerted effort to impose a similar sort of apartheid regime there. And as I noted in my previous comments about the class question, in the vanguard of seeking to execute the so-called Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, which barred the migration of people of Chinese ancestry to the so-called republic, was the so-called Working Man's Party of San Francisco, led by Irish Americans like Dennis Kearney. Now, that does not fit the theory of the case by many of our friends on the left who would like to think that we are all part of one united working class, all marching in lockstep, when actually, too often, a settler descendant working class has been enmeshed and involved in what we call class collaboration. That is to say, they ally with the ruling elite against the interests of the rest of us. And going forward, one of the lessons you can take away from this book is that we not only need to talk about white supremacy, which we should, and class collaboration, which we should, but also settler solidarity, and how this three-headed monster comes together to basically prevail in North America, in Hawaii, leading to one catastrophe after another.
Your title, The Counter-Revolution of 1893. Your terminology, counter-revolution, because you also have the counter-revolution in another book, The Counter-Revolution of 1776. Um, if you could elaborate on that term, the counter-revolution, and then how that applies to the Hawaii coup and the roots of U.S. imperialism.
Well, Counter-Revolution of 1776 obviously suggests that when George Washington and his comrades kicked out the British, one of the motive forces was to overthrow Native American polities, which proceeded to occur like dominoes falling from the eastern seaboard of North America all the way to California and across California into Hawaii. That is precisely a counter-revolution, an apartheid counter-revolution, and having, from their point of view, the collateral benefit of clearing the land for the expansion of the slave trade, which also takes place. And interestingly enough, after Britain loses its market in enslaved Africans in North America, its most lush and lucrative market, it then moves towards abolishing the slave trade in 1807 before the so-called Revolutionary Republic headquartered in Washington, which then follows suit and then abolishes slavery in 1833, decades before the abolition of slavery in the United States after a bloody war. I also have the Counter-Revolution of 1836, which deals with Texas, how Texas secedes from Mexico precisely because Mexico, under a president of African descent, Vicente Guerrero, had moved to abolish slavery. Stephen F. Austin, Sam Houston were not having it, then overthrow Mexican rule, set up an independent state, which then begins to challenge the United States for hegemony in the African slave trade. And in a few months, I'll have the Counter-Revolution of 1858, which deals with how the settlers overthrow indigenous rule in what is now Oregon and the state of Washington, are challenged by a man of African descent who's the founding father of British Columbia and what is now Canada, Sir James Douglas, who then seeks to attract Black people from San Francisco, which he does, but at the same time, it's too late. And so I think that if we're to understand what's going on in this country, this fairy tale that we've been taught about the United States as a shining city on the hill and how we should be trying to walk in the footsteps of slave owners like George Washington, for example, it just will not do. And I'm happy to say that in the New York-based publication called The Nation, in the run-up to July 4th, 2026, I'll have a review essay detailing many of these points, and I'll point your audience to it.
So from the coup to the annexation and the 1898 war in the Philippines. So we're expanding west to go east.
That's one way to put it.
Elaborate.
Or as they say in Washington now, you escalate to de-escalate.
Right, right.
What's interesting about the Philippines War is the participation of so many Black Americans as fighters and how so many of them defected to the Filipino side and actually became leaders of the insurgency, for example. I should also mention that many of the Black soldiers chose to stay on in the Philippines. Many of their descendants continue to reside there. You might also recall that the father of Black history, Carter G. Woodson, he seeks to defect to the Philippines. He teaches there for quite a while before being compelled to return to the U.S. mainland. And the father of Dennis Rodman, the former basketball star, as I understand it, still lives in the Filipino Islands and the Philippine Islands. And this is also part of the story that I try to tell, which is how Black Americans fleeing lynching and Jim Crow and harassment and persecution flee in mass across the Pacific, not only to Hawaii, but ultimately to the Philippines. And as I tell the story in my 1858 book, as noted, they also flee to British Columbia, for example. They flee to Canada, for example. One of the untold stories of Black American history is how so many of our ancestors continue to reside, or continue to have descendants that reside abroad.
So we have a tremendous number of historic examples of this expansionist, this imperialist, this settler colonialist mindset. And again, we see it playing itself out right before our very eyes today. But one of the big differences that I see between the then and the now is during the 1893 counter-revolution, America was on the ascendancy.
Hmm.
Now, when I listen to Pete Hegseth and the lies that he's telling, this now seems to be the last kicks of the dying mule can be the most dangerous. This whole idea over Taiwan, this talking about the annexation of Greenland, um, fighting with China, these now seem to be a an empire in decline and engaging in a dying imperialism as opposed to a growing imperialism, if that makes sense.
It certainly makes sense, and that's one of the problems with many in our civil rights community. At a time post 1954, when U.S. imperialism was on the ascendancy, recall that it emerged from World War II, 1945, with a good deal of its industrial plant intact, unlike its competitors in Japan and in the former Soviet Union and in Western Europe. And therefore, there was an ability to make certain concessions to the Black community, helping to buttress a growing Black middle class, for example. But now we're in a different atmosphere, we're in a different climate. In a sense, the civil rights community took what I call a married to the mob approach to US imperialism. That is to say, they're not going to necessarily inquire how the filthy lucre was obtained, how the mob obtained its riches. They just want their cut. They just want their share, for example. And so, if that sort of mentality were to obtain today, they would say, well, where's our share in terms of this escapade in Venezuela, for example?
Mm-hmm.
Where's our cut? As opposed to opposing this failed enterprise in Venezuela. Or they would ask, where's the Black share of the booty that they expect to garner from Iran? Obviously, the answer is there's no booty to be obtained from Iran because the world has changed. Iran has sturdy allies, not only in Russia and China, but Russia and China are in no mood to accommodate US imperialism. And US imperialism, because it does not face the kind of opposition it so deeply and richly merits at home, will continue to stumble into one quagmire after another until we are able to mount a sturdy opposition.
In fact, I want to approach that last question from a slightly different direction, as you talked about emerging with its industrial plant intact. Again, the United States during this period, 1893 and all the way through World War II, is a growing, thriving economy, and it is in search of resources in order to feed that industrial machine. Now the economy is on the wane, and Pete Hegseth sits before the Senate and says that this military industrial complex is lighting the lamps in small cities around the country and revitalizing industry. You can't grow your economy based on militarism. And I didn't hear, I didn't think I heard anybody in the Senate, as he said that, say, wait a minute, Pete, you obviously don't understand economics because you cannot revitalize the US economy based upon a war economy. That's just not going to work. That's all mythology, vaporware, and prestidigitation. Gerald Horne.
Well, it's even worse than what you so eloquently portray. What I mean by that is, in this book and in our earlier conversation, we were talking about white supremacy.
Mm-hmm.
And sadly and tragically, this is not a historical relic. Look at what's happening with regard to US relations with South Africa as we speak. Mr. Trump has objected to the president of South Africa being invited to the G8 meeting in France rather shortly. He's objected to Mr. Ramaphosa, the president of South Africa, being invited to the G20 meeting in the United States in a few months. And this has everything to do with his relationship with First Buddy, Elon Musk, who, as you know, was born in the land of apartheid and has a bone to pick to this very day with Pretoria because they overthrew his ideological ancestors, for example. And so at the same time, Mr. Trump is trying to pursue this white supremacist agenda. He's trying to cut deals somehow in South Africa for critical minerals, for rare earth minerals, which are disproportionately processed and mined in China. Now, you tell me how, on the one hand, you're going to discriminate against the leadership of South Africa, and on the other hand, expect the economy of South Africa to bail out the flailing US economy after China has cracked down on exporting rare earth minerals across the Pacific. Recall the fiasco that happened in South Korea in November 2025 with the meeting between President Xi and Mr. Trump, where Mr. Trump was forced to cry uncle because of this Chinese stranglehold over rare earth minerals, which was harming and continues to harm automobile production in particular in this country. And so the United States is tied up in all manner of contradictions, and it's fair to suggest that many of these contradictions have their predecessors with regard to the ill-advised, ill-fated overthrow of the Hawaiian monarch in 1893.
Well, I know the answer to your question about the South African economy and the contradiction. How do we expect to get those two things done? It's called the art of the deal.
Oh, I see.
And Pete Hegseth told us in the Senate that the United States has the ultimate negotiator at the table. So, Dr. Horne, I think the answer is right there. But in all seriousness, as we wrap this up, what are the three major points that you want the reader to walk away from the Counter-Revolution of 1893 having a clear understanding of?
Well, first of all, your audience needs to recognize that there is still a significant percentage of the indigenous Hawaiians that occupy and reside in the archipelago. They have not resigned themselves to losing sovereignty. And if the United States begins to crack up, which I think will happen sometime during the century, expect Hawaii to be in the forefront and expect indigenous Hawaiian sovereignty to be reasserted. Second of all, as suggested, in order to understand these repetitive debacles in Asia from the war with Japan, 1941 to 1945, Korea, 1950 to 1953, Vietnam concluding ignominiously in 1975, you have to go back to the roots, and the roots being in the Hawaiian archipelago and in the Philippines Islands, both in the 1890s. And then finally, with regard to the theme for this afternoon, which is white supremacy. White supremacy has taken many twists and turns. And as I've suggested just a moment or two ago, I think we need to supplement our discussion of white supremacy with its close cousins, those close cousins being class collaboration, which helps to explain the ideological weaknesses of the US working class. May 1st, yesterday, there were thousands marching all over the world as a result of the workers' holiday, not so much in North America. And then the third head of this three-headed monster is settler solidarity, which we really need to develop ideologically.
Dr. Gerald Horne, as always, thank you so much for your time. Greatly, greatly appreciate that analysis, and we look forward to having you back.
Thank you for inviting me.
Thank you, as always. Folks, the Counter-Revolution of 1893, the Hawaii coup, and the roots of U.S. imperialism in the Asian Pacific. I got to thank my guests. Thank you all as listeners. I am always blessed to have Daryl Green and Nick Vienna holding it down on the one and twos, because without them, I would just be sitting here talking to myself. Catherine Caperton, as always, thank you as well. Stay tuned for the Reese Colbert Show. Hey, folks, live each day like it's your last, because one day you'll be right. For peace within our own homes, at home and abroad, people with open hearts and open minds must dialogue, listen, and learn. Do yourselves and the world a great favor. Please, please play more John Coltrane. And this is the time of the day I gotta say, I am out.